Welcome to Inside Events, a new international podcast focused on contemporary issues in events and festivals. This week, I'm joined by Dr. Oscar Pinta. He allowed me not to use his the first part of the name. And we're going to be talking about LGBTQ plus in the context of events, which is an area that Oscar has kind of talked about for quite some time and published on. Welcome, Oscar. If you could talk a little bit about your role, your organization, and why you particularly interested in this topic area, Oscar.
Thank you so much, Mike, for having me. So I am Oscar Vorobjovas-Pinta, and I'm from the University of Tasmania. I'm a lecturer in tourism and society, and I coordinate the Masters of Tourism, Environmental and Cultural Heritage there. But as you rightly said, so I am interested in broader sense in LGBTQI plus tourism, but also in particular in the last few years, I've been focusing on festivals and events. And I guess I'm interested in this topic because lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer questioning, intersex, and other diverse sexual orientations, gender identities, and expressions events are important not only to this group of people, so not just to the LGBTQI plus communities, but also to understand the social change in general in our societies at large. So I believe that these events serve as crucial milestones in a way that provide insights into the ongoing evolution, if you may, of our societies. So. And it's also really interesting in terms of collecting data in regard to this concept, because there's so many ways of and angles that could be explored. And if you allow me, I will provide some examples. So, for example, my very first research into LGBTQI plus focused on the representation of the event on social media, so on Instagram, and basically looking at how people engage with the event, which was Broken Hill Festival in Broken Hill, and basically how they use social media as a medium in a way to express. I guess not just their sexuality, but also their experiences at that particular event. A couple of other projects that I've done where also one of them it was published in event management, that was on the analysis of annual reports of two major LGBTQI plus events in Australia, so namely Sydney Lesbian and Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras, which is held annually in Sydney, and as well as Midsummer Festival in Melbourne, and a couple of other projects that are on the way as well.
That's great. Thanks, Oscar. I truly believe in the power of events for social change. My area is not LGBTQ plus, but it's been around kind of how do events serve as a way to include socioeconomic diverse interests and showcase deprived communities and the cultures within them and that sort of thing. Truly believe that they are microcosms of where a society is at in its life cycle, if I can be so blasé around that. Do you think that they also serve as a driver of that change as well, that they can catalyze social change towards positive social outcomes for whatever kind of, I guess, critical issue, but particularly your topic, Oscar?
Definitely, and in particular, looking at how the events have evolved and how much interest there is in these events, and that interest comes not just from within the LGBT communities, but also from outside. So, as I mentioned earlier, I'm in particular interested now into the development or evolution of LGBTQI plus events in regional and rural Australia. And in the last 5 to 10 years, there have been many of these little events popping up all around Australia. And two of them in particular worth attention would be Broken Hill Festival, as I mentioned, in Broken Hill in rural New South Wales, and Fabulous, which is in Alice Springs in rural northern territory in Australia. And we can see how communities are using these events to kind of not just show support to the local LGBTQI plus communities, but also using it to attract tourists into these spaces. So research that hasn't been currently published yet kind of looks also at the stakeholder perspective into how these events contribute to the, I guess, local social capital, or rather local social fabric of these small communities as well. And we can really see how societies are actually really changing, right? So if initially there was some sort of opposition towards these events and kind of maybe people saw that there is a clear misalignment between the values of the town and values of the event, we see that we don't see that friction anymore. So really, if we think about LGBTQI plus festivals, of course they can be characterized as a leisure form that, kind of provides the temporal escape from the heteronormative strictures and kind of prevailing norms, and offers a taste of liberation closer to home. But it also kind of helps enhance that social fabric within the broader community, going beyond the LGBTQI plus acronym.
That's really useful. Thanks, Oscar. And is there any sense that, because I guess you there talk similar to how I talk, I'm always taking a really optimistic view of events, and I think of them as progressive things. And is there any examples of whereby events have been regressive and it's pushed back the cause? I'm just thinking of all my stuff's major events. So sorry, it gets really boring for anyone who kind of listens to this, because every example that I give is bloody major events. But how Russia, the World Cup in Russia, really cindered rights for gay people. After that event, it was an attack specifically. Is there examples of that, or on the whole, is it mainly good?
Look, I think there are some examples beyond the global north. I understand and acknowledge that most of my research is to do with global north, and we saw nothing but progress at least in that field, right? In terms of events, I don't have examples of where pride events or LGBTQI plus themed events would have been regressive. But you are very right, because if we think about certain countries like Russia, or not long ago Serbia, we saw a backlash that came with organizing pride events as well, right? But in a way, it is, whilst there is this backlash, I think they kind of serve the purpose, because they do inherently, if we think about pride events, right, it was born out of necessity to advocate for LGBTQI plus rights, right? Nobody was supporting. They were very grassroots, very kind of anti-government even sometimes, right? So if we think about the Stonewall riots in 1969, which arguably is where, the roots of LGBTQI plus pride events where it all started, we know that it was not all about, colorful rainbows and chanting, happy chants and dancing around, right? It was actually a fight for their rights. And I want to believe that, in countries such as Russia, even though they are so repressive towards their people, as we can see now with the war in Ukraine as well, that anti-LGBTQI plus sentiment is even, I think, bigger. Kind of, there's always they're always on looking for the next enemy, I guess, and LGBTQI plus communities very often fall victims for that as well. So, but as I say, I think they still serve a purpose, because it creates this possibility to be visible, right? The very fact that we are talking about LGBTQI plus rights in Russia, I think, emphasizes that as well.
I couldn't agree more. And interesting, they are microcosms, whether that's for good or bad. The creepy crawlies, I always say, kind of come crawling out, and you can at least they're exposed. the worst thing would be if everything just stayed under the carpet and wasn't exposed, because then you can do something about it, I guess, and that applies to a whole range of different
Mm,
things. In
mm,
terms of, you mentioned Stonewall being kind of the roots, and then obviously kind of the movement has grown so much to the point that we have a colorful calendar of Pride events globally, right?
mm.
In every destination that I've ever lived in, and visited. Where have we come from, Oscar? I guess in terms of the movement and in terms of events, and where do you think that the future's taking us in terms of this movement and events?
Yeah, so as I said, some scholars kind of suggest that LGBTQI plus events track back to the 1969 riots at Stonewall in New York, when we all know police raided the popular gay club there. However, I don't believe that LGBTQI plus movement can be attributed to one specific event per se. I think it's kind of a collection of various historical and structural processes that were enabled by changing politics, but also for a push for social change. So, and across the world, we see Pride events have continuously evolved into kind of connected way of thinking and recognition of differences in a celebrated open space. And for some, it's really rite of passage now, as well. So LGBTQI plus events really all about, to celebrate otherness, to celebrate LGBTQI plus communities, to celebrate culture. And as events evolve, and obviously they have evolved quite a lot, and to be more specific, as I mentioned earlier, my colleague Melissa Emerson Fong from Edith Cowan University and I published an article on the changing nature of LGBTQI plus events in Australia, and we published that in Event Management. And we kind of identified 5 overarching themes as to how events are changing, at least in Australia, but I think it can be attributed to many other LGBTQI plus events across at least global north. But we see so also increasingly, like in Taiwan, for example. So it goes beyond, right? Beyond the global north as well. So first of all, events kind of became mainstream tourist attractions. So if in the past it was really hard to attract funding to organize such events, in particular government funding, now governments really want to fund those types of events, really want to be associated with those events, in particular those hallmark events like Sydney Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras, right? Obviously, events still has this strong inherent support for LGBTQI plus communities living in Australia and beyond, and protecting their rights. They still continue to actively challenge the political and social status quo, kind of bringing the related issues into the public realm, right? So for a long time in Australia, for example, is what was the fight for marriage equality, until in 2017 we had this postal referendum, and it was voted and overwhelmingly voted in favour, and the law was passed. In the last couple of years, we see more activism about transgender rights as well, and obviously, I'm pretty sure there'll be other forms and other stances that LGBTQI plus communities will take as well. So fourth, also the events are about encouraging visibility and encouraging education of and about LGBTQI plus people, but also their culture. So it's basically about also understanding how the queer communities, I guess, came about. So the history of the activism, but increasingly so, we also see the need to support the art and also the artistic expression in general. So a great example would be a Midsummer Festival in Melbourne that attracts a lot of kind of artsy expressions. It's all about art and kind of, I guess, expressing uh, queerness through art as well. And probably increasingly so, my last point about how they are changing is that we see that LGBTQI plus events are really good at addressing and championing intersectionality amongst other marginalized groups.
Mm.
So in Australia, for example, that would be groups such as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and refugees, for example, as well. Um, so I think I covered those 5 themes quite in depth, but I'm happy to follow up on anything else if you have any further questions for me, Mike.
That's great, Oscar. And obviously, we'll put your article and various other articles for further reading if people are really interested to explore further. I know that a lot of my students are really interested in this topic, really, really passionate about it, whether on this particular topic or just the power of events just generally. I can't help but think, like, when I have a kind of chat with people about kind of women's rights, for example, in the Middle East, which is kind of essentially becoming a party every day, we always think about other critical issues. How does all of this look like in the Middle Eastern context? Do you know? Have you looked into that, or do you know anyone that's been trying to kind of transfer some of these kind of ideas and this movement to those contexts whereby there's less progress, I guess, in some sense, made? Is there anything that you could say on that, Oscar?
Oh, Mike, it looks like you're following me through my travels, as I just arrived from Dubai the other day, where I had a very fruitful discussion with a few of my colleagues there that are based in the Middle East, and we really talked about, in general terms, the critical tourism studies or critical event studies, whatever that is, in the Middle Eastern countries. And I think the approach is quite interesting, right? You can't just go and change and drop things onto people as if, dropping our worldview onto people there and saying, this is our way or any other way. Having been now to Dubai and kind of getting to know people living there, and a lot of LGBTQI plus people living there as well, I know that it exists there, right? Everyone knows that it exists there, and it's kind of a bit of a politics of kind of keeping a blind eye on certain things. But through that, we can see how perhaps little by little change could come, but we can't expect that the change will be immediate, for example, right? So to my knowledge, just a couple of months ago, in Dubai in particular, women now that are not married are allowed to have children, right? They don't need to leave anymore. I mean, I must say that these are foreign women, so where the Sharia law doesn't apply to them, right? So we see slightly more relaxed laws around alcohol, right? And so on and so forth. So we see that these changes are little by little happening, but to really predict the exact future trends for LGBTQI plus festivals and events, in particular in the Middle Eastern or African context, right? Like, we know that Uganda just went completely backwards with the criminalization of LGBTQI plus people. It's really challenging, and it's really, really, really hard because it has so many sensitivities around the culture, around the societal structures, and so on and so forth. I'm hopeful, though, that the change will come one day, but I don't expect that that's going to happen very quickly.
Little by little.
Probably not the answer that you were expecting, really, but I'm genuinely hopeful.
Yeah, I expected it, actually. The shifting of the dial on some of the some kind of social progress is just thinking about women's rights in Saudi. Women can drive now. That would have been unheard of 20 years ago. So I guess, little by little. And I guess this kind of goes back to Zayakis's point about event portfolios, which is just every event builds on the next, and it shifts the dial. And some dials are shifted in a slower way than others. But as long as we know and feel confident that the progress is in the right direction, then that's what we can. Because I found Qatar hosting the FIFA World Cup was a really interesting one, because they obviously had a huge backlash. Western media just piled in. And the assumption was that Qatar should have been like a well-developed Western nation that has never had any human rights records abuses ever before, have they? In these Western nations, and so on one side, I was thinking, well, human rights abuses, bad. We don't want anyone to die or be subjugated through hosting these things. On the other side, don't also apply the exact same principles from the West to Qatar, because it's an entirely different context. So I kind of felt, in some sense, that they needed to at least craft a better narrative about themselves in terms of social progress and where they were at, and be more open and transparent in terms of, we're here, but we do want to get to there on this social indicator. But we're not there yet,
Yeah, true. But I think we also shouldn't be very hypocritical about how we interpret human rights. Yes, of course, they are human rights abuses. I'm not denying that in Middle East, and LGBTQI plus people are repressed, and there's strong violations against women's rights. But when we think about, for example, refugee rights, right, or the rights of the First Nations people, there's significant issues in Australia as well as in Europe with these questions, right? In particular with the crisis, that was named the refugee crisis in Europe a couple of years ago, right? And we still see refugees coming through Belarus into Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia, and we see how these countries are treating refugees as well. Everything is done in kind of, I guess, more civil way, but it's still, I think, a lot for us to answer for. So I think we have to be really, really careful how we use the term human rights and how we throw this word around without really thinking how we actually contribute to, I guess, a development of better society in the world in general.
Couldn't agree with you anymore. Like it's there's so much hypocrisy, and it becomes about whose rights are more important in which context than in others. But everyone's human. It's quite incredible. Oscar, we'll definitely pop some of the resources related to this topic underneath the podcast if people are interested in learning further. We're out of time now. I know that you have to go and see your family who have just got to the hotel. But thank you so much for coming on Inside Events, and hopefully we'll have you back and we'll talk about some specific topics and issues going on in this domain in the future. So thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much, Mike.